Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill just passed and people are freaking the hell out for a number of reasons. Starting with the fact that the bill passed by the slimmest possible margin of 215 to 214, a vote that was made possible by the fact that the Democrats in the House have 3 vacant seats because their members died recently. The most recent being Jerry Connolly, who died yesterday, and the other 2 dying in March. Right? And those votes would have changed the final result, as the Republicans are not all on the same page. Because without rehashing everything I talked about yesterday, the key background that you need to know is that the main holdouts preventing the passing were hardline conservatives who wanted deeper cuts to offset the trillions of dollars that would be added to the deficit. With those members actually specifically calling for deeper cuts to Medicaid and other benefits programs, which is a move that was deeply opposed by more moderate blue state Republicans. Well, you had House Speaker Mike Johnson expressing confidence that he'd be able to appease the competing factions of his party and get the bill passed. Top conservative leaders said they needed more time to negotiate. We even had House Freedom Caucus Chair Representative Andy Harris explicitly saying yesterday that, as is, there was no way the bill would pass in the immediate future. But clearly, Johnson was ultimately able to secure enough votes for the far-right flank of his party to get it passed. And that, as some people have focused, that Harris himself ended up voting present on the legislation, with him being the only member to do that and explaining on X, "I voted to move the bill along in the process for the president. There is still a lot of work to be done in deficit reduction and ending waste, fraud, and abuse in the Medicaid program." Right? And then beyond that, we saw 2 other Republicans joining all Democrats in voting against the measure. And then there were also actually 2 that didn't vote at all, one because he fell asleep and the other because he couldn't get his voting card in time, though both later said that they would have voted yes. But hey, the main headline there is Johnson made it happen and it passed. Right? And so then, with all that, I want to highlight a few major changes that Johnson made to the initial version of the bill in order to get everyone on board. But definitely one of the most significant being one we talked about yesterday, which was increasing the cap on state and local tax deductions, or SALT, which lets taxpayers write off the amount that they paid in local taxes when they file federal taxes. Because initially, the first draft of the bill raised the cap from $10,000 to $30,000, but moderates said that they wouldn't vote for the legislation at all if it wasn't increased further. So Johnson struck a deal increasing it to $40,000 for people making under $500,000. An agreement that then pissed off the far-right wing of the party, which said that the change to the bill made it a non-starter for them. Which is then why it's especially notable that this agreement still ended up in the final version of the bill, which still managed to get enough support from the hardliner. And then beyond that, the final version of the bill also speeds up the timeline for enforcing Medicaid work requirements. Right? And those work requirements, they are arguably one of the most significant provisions in the bill and one of the most fiercely opposed by the Democrats. And specifically here, the bill would add a work requirement to Medicaid for poor, childless adults that requires that they're working 80 hours every month in order to stay enrolled, which is a move that the Congressional Budget Office estimates could kick 8.7 million poor Americans off their insurance and force millions more to face higher healthcare costs when taken alongside other changes in an earlier version of the bill. And while initially the new work requirement was set to go into effect on January 1st, 2029, in order to appease the hardliners, Johnson accelerated the timeline, so states have to implement the change by December 31st, 2026. And that is a huge significant thing because it gives states much less time to implement what's been described as the strictest Medicaid work requirement that congressional Republicans have ever put forward. Because according to the New York Times, under the provision, it would be easier to lose benefits and harder to re-enroll. And it would apply to a larger set of Medicaid recipients, including Americans previously determined to be too old to need such requirements. And you had the Times adding there that by designing the work requirement proposal to be so rigid, the change could be just as transformative to the program as other large cuts that Republicans rejected. Right? And that last part, it's super significant because not only did moderate Republicans fiercely oppose sweeping cuts, but Trump himself has repeatedly promised that no one would lose insurance. And with that, you had Democrats like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pushing back on Republican claims that this move isn't actually a huge cut, but rather an effort to root out fraud and waste in the Medicaid system. With AOC accusing Republicans of slapping together a rush bill that they themselves don't even fully know the contents of.
For my Republican colleagues who are sure what is in and not in this bill, in this process that has been this rushed, when you wake up in the morning, you will realize that you voted to defund Planned Parenthood and to take away health care from 13.7 million Americans. And when this country wakes up in the morning, there will be consequences to pay for this, and I yield back.
Then also, beyond that, there were several other notable changes to the big, beautiful bill. With this, including the addition of another $12 billion in funds to reimburse states for money spent on border security after Biden took office. And that is on top of the $175 billion in new spending that the bill already allocated for Trump's immigration enforcement. The proposal also expanded a ban on the use of Medicaid funds for gender transition measures, so it now pertains to adults as well, not just children and teenagers, as outlined in the earlier version. Then another new inclusion would deregulate gun gun silencers by removing them from the National Registry regulated under the National Firearms Act. Also, the new bill, it speeds up the phase out of clean energy tax credits that were put into place under the Biden administration. And then the final thing that I want to touch on here, there's more, but the last thing I'll do right here is it's not a substantial change in terms of actual policy, but rather it's kind of a weird little thing that Republicans did to suck up to Trump. Because one of the provisions in the original bill gave newborn babies born between January 1st, 2024 and December 31st, 2020 a $1,000 tax-free savings account called Money Account for Growth and Advancement, aka the MAGA account. But apparently, MAGA account was not clear enough that this policy was tied to Trump, and so Republicans changed the name so it literally is a Trump account. So yeah, they just found new fun ways to do tricks on it. But yeah, all of those are kind of the most significant changes. It's definitely not everything. I'm gonna link down to resources for bigger deep dives there. But now as far as what happens next, the bill is headed over to the Senate. And there you have Trump urging the chamber to pass the measure as soon as possible. But currently, it's unclear how soon it would happen, especially because it's widely predicted that the measure as is will face some major hurdles in the upper chamber. Because you have some Republican leaders making it very clear that they want to make some changes to the legislation, and changes that could test the compromises that Johnson made in order to secure the bill's passage in the House. Though, very big thing, because it's the Senate, Republicans will only need a simple majority to pass the so-called big beautiful bill, because the budget reconciliation process allows them to bypass the 60-vote filibuster usually required for most legislation there. And so that means that they can only afford to lose 3 Republican votes if the Democrats oppose it and J.D. Vance breaks the tie. And in the Senate, it's kind of similar to the House. You have some of the more fiscally conservative members demanding structural changes and deeper cuts to Medicaid and other benefits programs. But then at the same time, more moderate or politically vulnerable senators want to protect Medicaid and keep some clean energy tax credit. And at least 3 members have voiced concerns about the Medicaid cuts in the House bill. And one of them, Senator Josh Hawley, has openly said that he will oppose any bill that cuts the program. So it's not done. A lot could still play out, but we'll have to wait to see. Though generally speaking, we should know soon because the Republicans have set a July 4th deadline for this process to play out and send the bill to Trump's desk. And, as we've talked about before, that deadline is actually a fairly strict one because the bill also raises the debt limit. And the Treasury Secretary has said that the lawmakers have to take that step by mid-July if they want to avert the catastrophe of defaulting. And so, a lot is up in the air right now. We're gonna have to wait to see how this plays out, but this is something that we have to keep eyes on because depending on what is and is not in the final version of the bill, especially when you're talking about potentially kicking millions of Americans off their health insurance, could lead to massive pain and death. And that's just one piece of this otherwise just monstrously big legislation.